is a really, it's very, very concerning because it is leading to the price rise of pretty much every consumer and retail commodity out there. The consumer price index inflation, it has been above the 6% tolerance band of the RBI for more than 6 months now. Right now, it is close to 8%. But what's interesting is an aspect of inflation, and that is its correlation with climate change. More and more economists, policy experts, and environmentalists are highlighting this correlation between climate change and inflation. And this is not just happening in India, but all around the world. Let me give you some instances from India itself. The unprecedented heat wave that we saw in March and April this year in India, specifically in North India, it had a massive impact on the production of wheat in the country, and that in fact forced the Indian government to put a wheat export ban at a time when there was a global rise in demand for wheat. And under different circumstances, India could have really capitalized on that global demand because India is one of the largest producers of wheat and also the largest exporters of wheat. But at that time, in the Indian government chose to prioritize its own food security, which many experts believe was the right thing to do. Now, unseasonal rains and changing weather patterns have also led to a change in the sowing patterns of various food crops, and that once again is leading to inflationary pressures. Let me give you another example. Over the years, India has seen a massive increase in their energy demands, once again because of extreme temperatures, whether it's heat waves or cold waves in certain parts of the country. The energy demand has really increased, specifically in the last 5 to 10 years. Um, and that led to an acute shortage of coal last year and also this year. India had to increase its coal imports, and then again, that also leads to inflationary pressures. Weather related surprises are on the rise. It is making inflation patterns difficult to predict. And of course, that is becoming more and more challenging to stabilize inflation in the country. To talk about this correlation between inflation and climate change, I'm being joined by a very special guest, Ruhi Kumar. She is an independent climate strategist. She's also a well known climate change campaigner. Thank you so much, Ruhi, for taking out time and joining me on the program today.
Thank you so much, Priyata, for having me. I'm very excited to have this conversation with you on this very important issue.
Yeah. Rui, I want to start with understanding the impact that climate change is having on India's inflation. Of course, I gave a few examples in the introduction, but how
Right.
much in your expertise, how much of an impact is climate change having on India's economy?
Sure. Definitely, Priyata, to begin with, I want to say that climate change and economic impact is something that's only being looked at very recently because of the big margins that we're seeing, and as you just mentioned, with the inflation rates and the consumer index as well. So there's a study by Deloitte that says that by 2050 India will face a loss of $6 trillion, or as one would equate to 6% of India's GDP. And this study goes on to talk about the different, the reasons of this massive number that has been quoted in the study. Because again, the crop production, impacted by heat waves, floods, droughts, and there is a bunch of other numbers I want to like put out there just to begin with. One is also that there's a study by McKinsey that's claiming that there's going to be 2.5 to 4.5% of GDP loss by 2030. And this is because of the labor losses that we face. Because we need people in good health to function in all the industries that are related to the big sectors. in terms of manufacturing, agriculture, tourism, etc. And if we are talking about people's well-being being affected by climate change, and in specifically we're talking about humidity and heat wave, right? With temperatures soaring at 45 degrees, 48 degrees, I think it becomes harder and harder for people to work. And we are talking about people who are working in open land and factories, right? So
Hmm.
that those are two big numbers that have been quoted by Deloitte and McKinsey over the last year. And by doing some analysis of like what has actually been the economic loss. So I would say that $6 trillion is a very big number, even by 2050, for India to reconsider its policies
Hmm.
and the way we are responding to climate crisis.
Yeah. Ruhi, many experts are saying, in fact, I was reading this article by the HSBC, top brass, this report that they have sort of quoted, and they are saying that weather related surprises, of course, are on the rise, and that is making, inflation patterns harder to predict. And that, of course,
Correct.
is affecting India's economy as well. Can you give me some insights on that as well?
Absolutely. So let's just take a solid example. We are talking about 2021, looking, states of Maharashtra, Uttarakhand, Himachal Pradesh, Kerala, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Rajasthan, all of these states experiencing very heavy floods. I also
Hmm.
missed Andhra Pradesh and Karnataka. So I'm maybe now at this point of time we can actually count the number of states that did not have this flood, right?
Hmm.
And now
Hmm.
when you look at the flood and what it triggers, so flood is not just heavy rainfall. We're talking about a flood triggering a landslide, triggering massive and a landslide means that in hilly areas where the crop cultivation is happening, a lot of that land will be lost, right?
Hmm.
A lot of the
Hmm.
crops that are being cultivated, where we're talking about paddy or a lot of other important crops, will be looking at, like,
Lost, yeah.
the farmers, yeah, massive losses. And so landslide is one. Then we are talking about how it also does inundation in a lot of areas where crops that are not supposed to be exposed to so much of water will be exposed to so much x amount of water, resulting into like very quick degradation or even like massive losses, right?
Hmm.
So we are
Hmm.
talking about different examples, and all these states are big agriculture producing economies for our country. So whether you talk about paddy, you're talking about wheat, you're talking about cotton. Even one of the articles quoted about how Andhra Pradesh has faced a huge loss in terms of cotton, sunflower, which is again important for edible oils. We are talking about paddy, black gram, and all these important crops that were really affected in the state of Andhra Pradesh, to the extent of like 8 lakh hectares of
Hmm.
agricultural crop being lost. So these are like some of the examples I can point out, how like a flood can affect crops. And then of course if there's a shortage, and there are other factors combined with, we're talking about whether it's a political situation, a social situation, and a geopolitical situation in context of wheat, right? Because of the Ukraine crisis, the wheat imports demand increased because Ukraine is the ninth biggest wheat producer in the world, and we are the second biggest wheat producer in the world. So we were definitely approached from that point of view. But that's what I want to point out, that this is how it can really, really inflate prices for very, like, staple vegetables.
Yeah. Ruhi, do you think that there is a need to strengthen the economic analysis of climate change? And when I say climate change, these various, weather-related
Hmm.
disasters that we are having, or weather-related surprises that we are seeing. Do you think we are studying these events, these incidents enough in terms of the economic context of it?
So what I would say is that there's studies being done, but they're done in their own silos. So this study that you pointed out by the HSBC, one of the heads, right, Pranjul Bhandari, he's
Yes.
very well put that there is definitely, this lack of like this big gap in forecasting now for inflation because of climate change triggered events, right? At
Mm-hmm.
the same time, there are lots of climate scientists within India who are studying the patterns, right? At the same time, there are people studying the market and consumer patterns. So I feel that there is lack of integration and the working together of these experts. So there are
Hmm.
policies, there are interesting ideas, there are startups, there are lots of things happening, but they're
Hmm.
not happening from the point of view of like this big picture saying that, okay, if every year we're going to have this heat wave and we're going to have a crop loss, what is it that we are supposed to do to help the farmers and the soil? Because that's where it goes down to the basics. Is our soil going to be able to sustain that much crop? Is If the soil washes away, then there is no way we can grow. If there is no
Hmm.
water from the reservoir, if there's a drought, how can we, find a solution for that particular region? Because our geology, it changes literally every 5 kilometers, right? Or maybe, like, some might argue more or less, but it has to be that customized.
Hmm.
It cannot be
Hmm.
that there is one solution for one state and that's going to be applicable for the entire state. Like, look at the state of Maharashtra and Andhra Pradesh. They're big states. It's not possible that what happens in the west of Maharashtra is the same as east of Maharashtra. So I think there is lack of this integrated expert thinking to come up
Hmm.
with solutions. There
Hmm.
are definitely a lot of other studies coming here there, but then we're just only riding on data. There is actually very less conversion in terms of what can actually
Implementation
help
of,
people.
yeah,
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 for a common person and for
yeah,
people who are producing and who are at the forefront of climate change. We're talking about farmers, fishing communities, we're talking about Adivasi tribal communities. So all these communities are facing the worst of climate crisis impacts. So there is
yeah.
that lack of integration.
Yeah, so that brings me to my next question. Do you think that our policymakers are focusing enough, or do you think they are prioritizing climate change and its impact enough when it comes to formulating, policy changes or coming up with new policy? Do you think climate change is they're factoring in the impact of climate change as much as they should?
So I'll begin with saying that climate change is now being used as a buzzword by whether it's policymakers. I mean, I wouldn't say policymakers necessarily because they're trying, but there's definitely an inkling of saying that we're trying to include climate change, right?
Hmm.
But I would say the way it's not working is because, again, the holistic thinking is missing, right? If we're talking about, I'll give you a couple of examples in policy, right? In 2017 to 18, there was a national clean air plan that came out tackling India's air pollution and eventually people's health, because air pollution affects lungs and health. Then there have been different, climate change plans for each of the states that have been in the making. Some states have done better, some haven't as much. So there are lots of different policies. Okay, there's lots of policies on even water and whether it's even in terms of agriculture. But then again, they're sitting in different ministries, they're sitting in different departments. Nobody's thinking about this as a holistic problem. Even when we
Hmm.
do the budget, I did a Twitter thread on the budget, which a lot of people thought was this we haven't heard of, because in the budget itself, people allocate, the government allocates to different ministries. But when we look at climate change and the impact of climate change, it falls under many ministries
Right.
together. From
Right.
Ministry of Power, from Ministry of Port and Fisheries, to Ministry of Tribal Affairs, to Ministry of Agriculture, to Ministry of Health, Women. So how can you just then allocate climate budget to different ministries? There has to be like one thread going across and
Hmm.
saying that this is how we do it, from like extreme weather events to crop inflation crisis, and then to energy fuel prices, and then to like our forest land and conservations, right? Because at this point of time, I can tell you that the way we are going in terms of our forest policies, it's
Hmm.
extremely detrimental. Because
Hmm.
climate change mitigation is not just about producing solar and wind power. That is definitely required, and that is the way to go in terms of like technology and solutions. But then we can't get rid of most of our forest land, because according to the new forest conservation act, like the new FCA amendments,
Hmm. Hmm.
we are now including coffee, palm oil plantations, rubber plantations as part of the green cover. That is not forest. Forest is a biome. It's a biodiversity specific, element that
Yeah.
includes
An
forest,
entire
animals,
ecosystem.
flora,
Yeah.
fauna.
Hmm. Hmm.
Exactly. So you can't
Hmm.
just talk about compensatory forestation कि मैंने यहाँ से 100 पेड़ उखाड़ के कहीं और लगा दिया
कहीं
and
और
it's the
लगा.
same.
Yeah. Hmm.
It doesn't work, because what about the biome, right?
Hmm.
And we are dependent on the biome. That's what we're
Hmm.
not realizing. So I'm what I'm trying to say is that there are two ways, like two parts to it. One is
Hmm.
also conserving your existing biomes, whether it's like even the Chambal Valley ke dry lands, they have their own place. They are not wastelands. From there to deserts to forests to wetlands to mangroves to all of that, right? And then there is this part of mitigation in terms of the what is happening as the impact of the climate crisis,
Hmm.
which
Hmm. Hmm.
necessarily we have not created in the sense of like our generation, or even because it's like a global impact, because uh, the planet is one, it's not drawn by borders in terms of climate change, but it is a social and like human thing to draw borders, and we have these countries, so that's why it affects people more in some places than other, but at the same time it's one big problem. So it has to be
Absolutely.
done
And
as a
in fact,
two
what you said
approach.
about, even the climate change budget, it having, it being distributed amongst many ministries, and because the impact is coming under different ministries, and that I find is a
Yeah.
very interesting thing that you said, that there isn't a holistic plan on how to
No.
deal with climate change, and specifically what is happening in present times, how climate change is affecting a whole bunch of different people and ecosystems and states, and just very
Yeah.
different
Yeah.
lands. So there isn't
Yeah.
a very holistic plan to deal with climate change, and I think that holistic plan is what is required. uh, Louis, for the benefit of our viewers, can you talk about the biggest instances of climate change, or unseasonal weather related events that is having an effect on the economy of the country?
Right.
Maybe not just in India, in fact, around
Yeah.
the world also. You can give us some instances.
So I would give the instance of two big events that have come to us in different times. So one is the Australian bushfires, and the other is the locust swarms. So I don't know if you
Hmm.
remember in 2020 when the pandemic had just started, there were these big locusts that came from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then to India. You
Yes.
know, now
Hmm.
people, obviously the news also was just focusing on like it's going to destroy the crops, and they're coming from this part of the like West Asia and then from Africa, but the
Yeah,
actual story about it.
it was so crazy because it had sort of become a political. They had even politicized
Yeah.
something like this. Yeah,
Yeah,
the
correct.
media
but
had.
but
Yeah.
the but the real story about the locust swarms is about a story about climate change, the reality of climate change, where how there were two, three, or maybe four hurricanes that formed around Eritrea, or where Ethiopia is, the Horn of Africa, around
Hmm.
that area,
Hmm.
which is very unusual. And hurricanes are formed because of warming sea temperature, which is a direct impact of climate change, right? Because of
Right.
global warming, the seawater becomes hotter, and because of that there are more hurricanes and more intense and frequent. Because of those hurricanes, there was a cyclone, sorry, there was a flood that happened continuously in Ethiopia, Kenya, and those regions. And because that happened towards somewhere towards the last half of 2019, these locusts actually started forming in there, and the route of the locust swarm was from Kenya, Ethiopia, Yemen, then crossing the Gulf, and then Afghanistan, Pakistan, India. And it's very interesting because it affected the crops there, right? In East Horn of Africa, it affected the crops here, but it was a formation from global warming after effects, right?
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
in that sense, I could say that that and the bushfires, right? At the same time, there was a heat wave in Australia, which was causing these bushfires, and there was this massive flood that was happening in Horn of Africa. It is
Hmm.
because of a particular thing called the positive dipole, basically like a current that makes gives too much heat and then too much of precipitation on the other side. And scientists have said that climate change is one of the main triggers of having such variation temperatures, right? So this is a very good example of how this is a really big event reported in different forms, the bushfires, the locust swarms, but then this is how actually climate change impacts actually affect people from across the world.
Yeah, and of course their economies as well.
Yeah.
Most scientists, most environmentalists they say that to fight inflation, we have to fight climate change. Do you agree with that?
Well, if most of them are saying that now, I'm very happy to hear that because I do agree with it. Because until some years back, I don't think there was any understanding of the link between inflation and climate change impacts,
Yeah.
and I fully agree with that. Which is why it needs to be looked into a more holistic way, and not just
Hmm.
saying that, I mean, now that you've made the link, there are so many different like elements to that, and or
Hmm.
puzzles that need to be solved, at a
Hmm.
very like macro level.
Hmm. So, do you think that it is what I mean to ask is, do you think it is now time to prioritize climate change when it comes to our policy as opposed to economic growth, and sort of put economic growth on in the backseat for a bit? Because at the end of the day, if inflation is being affected, I mean, if inflation is happening because of climate change and that is impacting various economies of the world, do you think now it is time to prioritize climate change over economic growth?
So, what I would want to say, Priyata, is that it is time to prioritize climate change, but I won't say over economic growth, because the issue is that the moment we put them in different paradigms, they start to seem like one is less important and one is more important. And
Hmm.
economy is something that's going to be never less important.
Hmm.
Is one of it, that's the reality, right? Whether it was
Hmm.
the pandemic, whether it's been social unrest or whatever, economy is at the heart of everything. And how people are being affected in various social, financial, even like mental forms, right, in
Hmm.
terms of stress. So I
Hmm.
think what needs to be figured out, and which is this is the tricky part, that the existing economic models have been created to exclude nature already. If you look at post industrial revolution era, when the stock markets began, the way it all started was to exclude all of the biomes and biodiversity, and just concentrate on the metals, the heavy
Yeah.
metals and the steel, whatever, right? But that model is clearly not resulting into something that we wish to achieve. It's now degrading the entire planet way faster.
Yeah. And
So
certainly
it
not
also,
sustainable right now.
absolutely not. And which is why it also needs to be looked from the lens of like consumerism, and like from the lens of like what how are people being misled to believe that consuming in a certain manner is going to really uplift their lives, right?
Hmm.
And of course it can sound very privileged for us sitting in our houses, in our desks, and in a comfortable space. But essentially what I'm trying to say is, even that at this point of time, we really need to rethink a lot of ways a lot of our sectors and industries are working. Because
Yeah.
I'll give you a small example. If fossil fuels phase out is going to happen, it's going to affect every industry that uses fossil fuels for their production and manufacture and distribution. So how is that plan going to look like? What is going to
Hmm.
happen to the workers who work in the coal mine? There has to be a transition plan for them. Just
Yeah.
because they are the workers in the coal mine doesn't mean that they are left unemployed, right?
Hmm.
So there are a lot of important equity angles that need to be considered.
Yeah.
And this particular existing model is super, like it's already quite bad, like you said, for in general, for everyone, not just the planet, but for human beings from different
Hmm.
class, caste, strata.
Hmm.
It's just affecting people in a different way. So the example that to translate what you're saying is that there is still so much of investment in coal mining, future coal mines, not just current. So current I understand, because we can't withdraw suddenly, right? We are
Hmm.
already at a capacity and we need this energy. But if you want to make a phase out plan, then we have to put this investment somewhere else, because there's not going to be unlimited amount of money that our economy can pump into different things. So I
Yeah.
completely agree with that. The
So, which
prioritization,
is why I meant that we need to prioritize investment, and
yeah,
that is probably going to not,
yeah.
for some years, for maybe a decade or two, not lead to massive economic growth, right?
Correct. So we have to be ready for some amount of, and then figure out solutions, that if there is a stagnation like that, how do we combat that, right?
Hmm.
Like, these are all problems to solve, and we have very smart people in this country from different sectors, from different stratas of society, who can work together. The
Hmm.
main
Hmm.
thing is
Hmm.
about getting people together and working together and finding the right kind of, it's like facilitating this. It's really high time.
Yeah. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, when he attended the COP26 last year in Glasgow, he made these really important pledges for India,
Yeah.
which I feel are very, very important to implement. One of them was that we are going to become carbon neutral by 2070. By 2030, our dependency on fossil fuels are going to decrease by 50%, so and so on and so forth. Do you see our policies? um, you know, do you see these pledges reflecting in the policies right now?
So I would say, so there are two parts to it. One part is that the policies are being reflected in terms of generation of clean energy, right? The creation of clean energy. But then are people being encouraged to use clean energy in residential form? Now there have been a lot of policy changes in the past 1.5 years, the details of which I can't really explain in that many details. But then the reality is that one is to produce it and one is to encourage consumer patterns, right? So
Hmm.
those are not matching.
Hmm.
Secondly, I would say that the whole thing on mitigation, the whole thing on like combating climate change also comes from conserving your existing biomes, like I said, your forests, your wetlands, your mangroves, and because they are going to be the biggest defenses against sea level rise, mangroves and cyclones, which we get hit by almost every year now, at least 2 or 3 severe cyclones. So where is that action happening, right? We need both of them. So while their pledges are being made by our leaders at a global platform, and I know that even our environment minister Bhupendra Yadav has gone and given big numbers and promises, which I'm hopeful for in terms of what
Hmm.
happens
Hmm.
for our future and our
Hmm.
present. Because
Hmm.
2070 is very far away. We are living in 2022, and we are estimating, like one of the studies saying, the GDP loss by 2030 at 2.5, 4.5% because of
Hmm.
labor issues caused by health effects of climate change. So definitely we have to think about the present as well. We have to think
Hmm.
about now what we can do in terms of mitigating, and not something which is 50 years later. I mean, it's
Hmm.
great to promise something that happens 50 years later, and we need a plan, but we need to see the actions. We need to divest from future coal mines. We need to talk about conservation and redefining forests for a green cover and not include
Hmm.
rubber plantations. I mean, that's just ridiculous, right? So
Yeah.
I think we need to see action in that form. We need to see action for our rivers. There's so much of talks about rivers and linking rivers, but we need to see action there as well. So I
Hmm.
think there are lots of policies, but a lot of implementation is missing, or like I said, the integration of policies needs to happen.
If you were to highlight some of the issues that need immediate attention from the government or in terms of our policies, what would that be in India?
So I would say soil is a very largely ignored element. Everybody talks about air because air pollution has become a big issue. It is. People are talking about water scarcity. It needs to be spoken about. Soil is a completely ignored element because it pretty much determines everything from your water retention to your crops to your forest, everything. The health of soil is very very important, and that's not something that is being looked on. And rather than that, we are pushing for big companies, GMO pesticides to be put in our chemicals in our soil. And
Hmm.
I think that's completely ignored, considering that we are largely an agrarian country, and what we need to look after for our farmers and necessarily for our soil.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean,
Uh,
in that sense, one, but I could point out maybe two, three, but I'm sure we don't have that much time.
you could maybe one more. You could.
Yeah, so I would say the other thing we need to really look at is transportation, and in the sense of affordable, available, safe, and equitable transportation. Because the way we are making our transportation lines, which includes metros in different cities, is being done. It almost looks like कि उस शहर में किया तो हमको भी करना है. That's not how it's supposed to be done. It's supposed to be done in a way like a city like Mumbai needs a very different transportation plan because we are by the sea, right?
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
we are originally a wetland, reclaimed land, right? And we are being flooded every year because of bad city plans that have happened in the past many decades. So
Yeah.
I would say that a good transportation system is necessary because that's how we'll reduce the number of cars, hopefully, on the streets. But
Yeah.
that also has other factors around, like people having social issues around taking public transport and not driving their own cars. But yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Ruhi, for joining me on the program today. I think it was a very, very informative and educational conversation discussion that we had. This sort of correlation between inflation and climate change is one that is being highlighted, and I think needs to be highlighted even more. And like we have spoken in this discussion, it needs to be prioritized in the kind of policies that are being implemented in the country as well. Thank you so much, Rui, for joining me
Thank you so much,
on the
Priyata, for
program
the
today.
session. It was very nice. Yeah.
I hope you enjoyed the session.
It was great, and I'm so glad that we spoke about this because this is a very, one of those topics that usually doesn't come up when we talk about inflation, but like all
Yeah,
the other factors are triggered, but it kind of points towards a lot, like, a simple thing, that why is the crop expensive? Like,
yeah.
it's not that hard to figure. So thank you so
It's
much for this
not. It's not
conversation.
at all.
Yeah.
It's not. It's
Yeah.
it's all pointing in this direction.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you for that.
Me too. Thank you so much, Rohi. To all of our viewers who watched our discussion today, thank you so much for taking our time and doing that. You can follow me on my social media handles. I'm on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And you can reach out to me if you have suggestions about the topics we should cover on the Insight edition. You'll find me once again tomorrow at 2 p.m. with another big topic of the week. Thank you once again to all of our viewers for watching. And thank you so much, Rohi, once again.
Thank you so much, Priyata, and thanks everyone for watching. Bye bye.
Bye.